Euston, 25 k's New South Wales side of Euston. I've got 10,000 acres of crop there and 1,500 sheep who I haven't seen for quite some time. And the department in Sydney then informed me that I needed to take the 43 tonne of hay to Melbourne, fly it to Sydney, and then sit in Sydney for 14 days and then transport it to Euston to feed my sheep. So 14 days later, the sheep would get some feed and the hay would have a joy flight to Sydney and sit in quarantine.
Jane Marwick, your thoughts?
I can't say what I really think on live television, Peter. I think there's some dopey pen pusher sitting behind a desk who hasn't skipped a beat during the COVID-19 lockdowns, some bureaucrat who is on full pay, who has no idea what people in the regions in particular are going through, and that is not to diminish what people in Melbourne are going through. We see this time and time again. I mean, fly 43 tonnes of hay to Sydney and quarantine. I mean, it shows how out of touch the decision makers really are. And there's a story in today's West Australian about a woman called Sue Hart, and she's in the early stages of Parkinson's disease, and she contacted the authorities for an exemption to go to the United Kingdom to see her son, and she got a reply. She wrote to the paper, I tweeted it, and the BBC have retweeted it, so too the Daily Mail, so hopefully someone interviews this woman and eventually we see her story spread far and wide. But basically, she said she's responsible, she's mature, she would isolate, pay for it, she's sensible, she would follow all health directives, but she wants to go and see her son, presumably, before her health really deteriorates. And instead she got some computer-generated response and a little thing to say that the authorities are aware of her. So she said presumably she's on some kind of a watch list now. Now, what I have been asking from the start, Peter, is who is making these decisions? They seem to me to be arbitrary. We saw it with Chris, the farmer. We're seeing it with Sue Hart. Who is making the decisions? It seems to me that for people who need to travel overseas or interstate, it depends on whose desk your inquiry or request for an exemption lands.
And I think, Jane, that is the frustration that exists here. If you get an empathetic bureaucrat, you might be okay. But if you get someone who's really hard line and they stick into the letter of the law, it has to finish up you. I know people have hired lawyers to write to the chief medical officer to say, can you have a look at this personally? And of course then, they've got to pay lawyers and it's crazy. God bless her, Greta Thunberg, she's gone back to school.
Oh, yeah, about time. I don't join the Greta pylon because when all this started, she was 16 and she has Asperger's. So I don't know. I'm no expert. I don't know how that affects her. I blame the adults around Greta. It is time for Greta to be back at school. She's probably learned a lot in the big wide world, sailing around on carbon neutral yachts and the whole bit. It is time for Greta to go back to... We both know she's going to be forgotten in 10 years' time. I just feel that she's been used. And the adults in the room, I think, have let Greta down grievously. I'm glad she's back at school, aren't you?
And what about this obsession with the vaccine and not treatment? Why are we buying this?
Okay, so we heard the Prime Minister last week coming out and sort of trailed around the idea that this vaccine, they'd signed this letter of intent with Oxford University or those in charge of that vaccine study trial. There is no vaccine. And the idea that a rushed vaccine would be mandatory, I think, sent shudders down the most reasonable spines around Australia. There's no vaccine. Why aren't we looking at treatments in conjunction with, in concert with vaccines? We know HIV doesn't have a vaccine. We know that effective COVID vaccines are virtually, well, they're non-existent. And we know too, Peter, that with the flu, sometimes the seasonal vaccine for the flu is only 20 or 30% effective, 20 to 60% effective. So why aren't we looking at treatments? Why the demonisation of someone like Professor Barodi, who isn't some nutter? He's an eminent physician who found the treatment for Helicobacter. All right, so Robin Warren and Barry Marshall won the Nobel Prize. They discovered that bacteria could live in the gut. Professor Barodi then found the treatment. He also wrote the recommendation for Barry Marshall to get a Nobel Prize. So why aren't we looking at both of these things? Why the obsession with a vaccine that we might never get? It, to me, is nonsensical and begs a lot of questions.
Indeed. Jane Marwick, it's always a pleasure to have you on Sky News.
Thank you.